just thought it was Jim.
You went to watch the rest of the movie. Just
That is.
Don't talk.
You're not too fun. You play Fortnite. You probably maxed out.
All right, shh. Really, seriously, we got what, half an hour? You're gonna have to listen fast as you write. Jamie, keep going. Malcolm X, if you don't know, was a civil rights leader. He's distinguished from Martin Luther King. The reason you don't know Malcolm X like you know MLK is because Martin Luther King Jr. brought the civil rights movement to the forefront with his peaceful protest and his constant beating of the drum that we cannot get violent. In fact, if it got violent in some places, they would call him in to try to calm things down so that knowing that the rest of the world, that the people you need to reach, you might see them as your enemy right now, but they're the ones you need to reach for us to have our just cause come to fruition. Well, Malcolm X wasn't like that. Malcolm X was more of a kind of guy who was like, you know what? They got to change their ways or else. So he was more militant. He wasn't like King. He says, you know what? And some people need to be roughed up, or we need to use more militant tactics. We need to use violence. Well, then so be it. And he was involved with a group called the NOI, the Nation of Islam. And the Nation of Islam, if you know their history, they're not real strong patriotic Americans, to say the least. And you know, if you know all the teachings of those that adhere to strict Islamic teaching, you know that violence is part of the deal. So he had a falling out with them, and then they killed him. A member, I shouldn't say they, but a member of the Nation of Islam kills him in February of 1965. So for some people, even in the civil rights movement, they might have cheered that because they're like, you know, we need to get this guy out of the way because he's going to cause a lot of people not to join our fight. And then this big march from Selma to Montgomery. What state is that? Yeah, we're in Alabama. Things happening in Birmingham, Montgomery. Alabama is like ground zero, Noel, for this civil rights movement that was happening in the 1960s. Interestingly enough, this is in March 1965, and Montgomery, and the authorities step in and say, you don't have the right permits. Of course, they stopped the march. And they started another day. We can't do it like this. So finally, the march takes, and it's the thing people watching their televisions would be able to see is the people that were going against them, treating them hard. The marchers were going along peacefully. Well, again, like Malcolm X, not everybody agreed with Martin Luther King's ways. They thought Martin Luther King was naive. You're never going to change these people. You have to force them to change. Pass this law, they passed that law. But we all know they've been passing laws from the end of the Civil War to 1964. Have we been passing laws throughout the country that we're going to change the way we treat blacks? Of course we were. Did that affect the people in these southern states? No, they always found loopholes. They always found ways around it. Malcolm X and many other blacks were like, that's not how it's going to change. That's going to change. We have to force the change. So there was a series of riots. And the biggest one that stands out in history, it's in bold print there, is that a riot that took place in South Central Los Angeles, a neighborhood called the Watts. And it ended up with 34 people dead, 3,000. And the number they have in the notes is $40 of damage. In the video, it's going to say closer to 200 million. So I don't know which number came You know, sometimes assess damage like on the spot, you say, whoa, there's like that much damage. And then later you actually calculate it. So the numbers are so far off, I'm not sure which one's more accurate, but suffice to say that in those dollars back in 1960s, that would be closer to probably $500 million. I mean, they were burning up, which you'll see, burning up the whole neighborhood. And they thought that was the only way they're gonna. Hey, we got laws, the judicial system. If there are cops that are purposely trying to kill black people, it'll get taken care of. Oh, no, it won't, so they burn up cities. Or tear down in Newark. You know what state Newark's in? Detroit's in that state up north. What about Newark? Anybody? Newark is what? Yes, right across the river from New York. So if you go from Newark, Jersey, across the Hudson to New York, I mean, that's like a huge metropolis, right? You wouldn't even notice that you went from another state to a city to another. Basically, Newark's that big. Newark, New Jersey. Major riots there in 1967. So how about we pause and watch that video of awfulness of the Watts riots. By the way, this video is not a war video.
Stop suffering without AC. Cool it yourself with AC Pro. In just 3 easy steps, enjoy the comfort of 2 times the one selling coldest air. Nothing cools like AC Pro. 6 days.
I was going to say, this isn't like a war zone. Well, kind of. This is a city in America.
6 days of rioting in the Negro section of Los Angeles left behind scenes reminiscent of war-torn cities. More than 100 square blocks were decimated by fire and looters, and few buildings were left intact. Firemen were harassed by snipers and brick-throwing hoodlums as they attempted to control the fires, many of which were left to burn themselves out. As the National Guard moved in to restore comparative calm, the losses by fire alone were put at $200 million. No attempt has yet been made to estimate the loss at the hands of the looters who stole everything from liquor to events. Firemen were later issued flak suits of bulletproof mesh to protect them from snipers who continued to shoot from rooftops.
Get that? Firemen coming to put the fires out, they still shoot.
Nearly 3,000 were arrested, and authorities had to open abandoned jails to house those sent by the police. It took the appearance of 14,000 troops to bring an end to what both Negro and white leaders called insurrection by hoodlums. Civil rights leaders were quick to deplore the unbridled lawlessness, and Martin Luther King vowed to do all in his power to prevent a recurrence in Los Angeles or anywhere. An uneasy calm prevails in what is known as the Watts area of the city. A curfew was put into effect, and the entire section declared off limits to all but residents. The people who live here are suffering great hardship with no grocery, drug, or other service stores able to operate. Breaks out anew. The riots in Los Angeles have written a sorrowful page in American history.
Sorrowful indeed. By the way, yes. When I often try to, when we talk about the bad news that's going on in the world, say that things seem like they'll never get better, but they often do. I mean, look what we came back from, right? This stuff was going on and when I was a kid. So we can get back to quote unquote normal, perhaps. All right, continuing on. We have something else that took place during 1966, and that is the French. You heard of this organization called NATO. Why is this in there? U.S. history. Why is this in your notes? Because it's significant, because what's going on in Vietnam in the mid-60s as America is ramping up our involvement in Vietnam, who used to be in control of that area? France. Who wants no part of it now? France. So in 1966, France, NATO, is an alliance. They got an alliance with America. If someone attacks America, doesn't France have to help? So France decides with their president, Charles de Gaulle, that we're going to quit NATO. Of course, they're back in it now, but they decided to quit NATO so that they wouldn't have to have nothing to do with Vietnam. With civics amendment, they wouldn't have to, right? They would not have to be like a witness against themselves. You do not have to speak if you're being arrested. You have a right to the counsel. You can until shows up. Well, that's where that law came from. And then this is interesting because you might have heard, if you pay attention to the news, you may have heard of the 12th Amendment even recently in the news. What's that have to do with? Why was it in 1967? Because what happens if the president is not able to be the president? The 25th Amendment outlined, hey, what if the president dies in office, which happened many times in our history, right? Now that's written down. That's part of our Constitution, that the vice president becomes. What if the vice president plus the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense, secretaries and the president's, what's that group called? Start to see cabinet. What if a majority of them decide that the president doesn't have it anymore? They, according to the 25th Amendment, they write a letter to Congress saying that the president is no longer able to execute his duties. And the president would be out. Sometimes the president, also in the 25th Amendment, is, let's say the president's going to go have surgery. Or what happened to President Reagan? When we get to him, you might already know that he got shot 2 months into his presidency. What happens if he's going into surgery? He can voluntarily discharge his duties. He can say, I am saying I am not able to fulfill the duties of president for a temporary period of time. So he would submit that in writing. Congress would then say, okay, the vice president's in control until we're never taken care of. The founding of the country, they founded the most incredible country in the world, but they're not saints and it's not perfect, right? It's still the greatest in the world, even with Milad. The 6-Day War happened in 1967. Why does that matter to us in U.S. history? The 6-Day War was and all the surrounding Arab nations around her. That's important to us because we support Israel. It's important to Israel because they don't have many friends, but the best friend they have is the biggest guy on the block, right? So that's important that we understand what happens to Israel. What happens in Israel really does affect us. The United States and Israel are very strong allies. By the way, when did Israel even become a country? Right? It didn't become a country that we see on the map today until 1948, when finally the United Nations said, okay, we're recognizing this sliver of land. By the way, what we see on the map called Israel, that sliver, can you picture it? Because I'm trying to go fast. Do you think that's the land that God outlined for Abraham when he went into Canaan to stake out Israeli territory? No, it's just a very small portion, right? But there's still many people that don't think Israel deserves even what they have. They'd like to see them wiped off the face of the earth. So it's important what happens in Israel with the war. And then the last thing on this slide is important note, especially after yesterday, that the first black man or woman to be on the Supreme Court was a man named Thurgood Marshall, and that happened on October 2nd, 1967. 25 years later, a man named Clarence Thomas was on the Supreme Court. He's still on the Supreme Court. And then yesterday, the first black woman, on the United States Supreme Court. So, I don't know. Can you be a racist country and have a black president elected twice? And have blacks on the Supreme Court and blacks in Canada? Are there racists in Cambodia? Are there racists in China?
No.
No? I'm gonna skip the 6-day war video now. And it was Israel against all the neighbors. Israel had no chance. They were like 100-1 odds against them. Who do you think won? All right. Finishing the notes, and then we'll get to the video. Unfortunately, why did I entitle this 1968? I didn't even know what to say other than wow. I mean, we've got the Tet Offensive, where Americans are we doing in that jungle? Why is my son, brother, father, uncle fighting in that place? What are we going to accomplish? How's that affecting our lives here? And when they saw it come into their living room, what happened at the Tet Offensive, it's a turning point because it's kind of the beginning of Americans saying, we don't really want to do. And then comes April 1st, which was just the other day. 44 years ago, 54 years ago. After he'd just given one of his, it becomes a really famous speech because he had just given the speech and he was there too. He was there because there was conflict going on. In this case, it wasn't necessarily for a union thing, and a lot of the workers were black, so he was going there, and it was getting violent. So who do they call in? Martin Luther King. Let's do this peace. He's developed all this clout with city leaders that they know if he comes, that things will probably calm down. And somebody decides to, hey, I know where he's staying at that hotel. This is the hotel they stayed in a lot. So unbelievably, these people with such skill use it for such evil. One shot took them out from like 100 yards away, hundreds of them. You think that's bad? Well, here we go. The brother of John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy. Robert F. Kennedy is making his way up through just won the Democratic nomination for president in California. Deal. If you win the Democratic nomination in California, you might be on your way to being the Democratic national candidate. It might be you, because Johnson decided not to run. It might be you against Richard Nixon. Imagine that Robert Kennedy might have had a pretty good chance to win, right? JFK barely won, but like a lot of things, after someone dies, did you ever notice their status goes up? Like Elvis was a big deal. Do you think Elvis was a big deal while he was living or after he died? Was he a bigger deal? Yeah, they become bigger even in death as far as popularity. So the idea that JFK's brother is going to be able to become president, that was going to be a very close race. Well, someone obviously didn't. Sirhan, and Robert F. Kennedy gives a speech right after he wins the primary, and someone walks up and kills him. 1968. Wow. Some things never change. Soviet Union decides whenever they want that they just go into these countries. Any country that tries to assert themselves and assert their independence, oh no, you're not doing that. Czechoslovakia had a little bit of an uprising in 1968. Since the World War II ended, the Soviet Union, USSR, Russia, kind of took over the whole Eastern bloc of by Russia. Well, they can't that, so they went in. And Putin decided that he wants to put back the old Soviet Union. So, hey, a big piece to the old Soviet Union was Ukraine. Remember we said it was it's the breadbasket of Eastern Europe. Not only that, so many other natural resources, and make sure that they do things the way we want them to. So if you're all caught up with notes, then we'll catch up with those videos and get you your, how about I pass this out now? So I'm not trying to flag you down on the way out. When's this? Tuesday.
What?
Caleb, don't wait till Monday night.
Is it just everything on the crossword?
Basically. Maybe.
All for the boy.
Any extras? Verity, if you have any extras, pass them to your left, please.
Here you go.
If you have any extras, pass them to your left, please.
I don't
Extra, read all about it.
Ever.
Any extras? Everybody got one?
No.
So between the crossword and Jake's Quizlet,
Yep.
you guys should be.
Yeah, Mackenzie's was reliable. Don't laugh, Jennifer.
In just 6 days, the state of Israel shocked the world, forcing its 5 surrounding nations to not only defeat their enemy, but gain a stronghold on the entire region. How did Israel
Biblical
win
scholars,
the 6 Day
this
war?
might remind you of like Jericho. Ah,
From June 5th until June 10th, 1967, Israel fought against the surrounding and regional nations of Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and Lebanon in what became a watershed moment for the recently formed nation.
that looks like a fair fight.
Followed was nothing short of miraculous, as events swung heavily in favor of the tiny nation of Israel. In the weeks before war broke out, the mood of the Israelis was foreboding, and in the words of David Rubinger, a photographer during the conflict, in the weeks before the war, there was a sense of doom. The national stadium was prepared for 40,000 graves, and even if we thought we might win, it would be a costly victory. The Israelis were heavily outnumbered and outgunned by the Arab nations, who had over 500,000 troops, almost 1,000 combat aircraft, and over 2,000 tanks, compared to Israel's army, which consisted of 300 aircraft, 800 tanks, and 250,000 troops. However, a monumental false reports claiming Vincent's conflict, which led to Syria and Jordan initiating strikes against Israel. Israel's preparations paid off, and by the end of the first day of the conflict, Israel had achieved air superiority. Over the next 5 days, the IDF went on the offensive on 3 fronts, advancing into the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. Casualties for the Arab nations were very heavy and extreme for such a short period of time. Over 20,000 Arab soldiers were killed or missing compared to less than 1,000 Israeli soldiers. A number of reports from the conflict recorded how Arab civilians and local militia confused the Israeli forces with those of Iraq. Colonel Uri Benari gave an account of this when they captured the West Bank town of Shechem. At the entrance to Shechem stood thousands of Arabs who waved white handkerchiefs and clapped their hands. In our naivete, we returned greetings and smiles. We entered the town and wondered, we are advancing and there is no disorder, no panic. The local armed guards stand by with rifles in their hands keeping order, and the crowds are cheering. I didn't comprehend what had transpired. Only later did I understand. The residents of Shechem thought that we were the Iraqi forces who were due to arrive from the direction of Jordan. Other eyewitness accounts speak of panic-stricken Syrian troops who became paralyzed and were unable to return fire, unexploded shells that landed atop a munitions vehicle, and the inexplicable lack of response from Egyptian and other Arab forces when fighting first broke out. In just 6 days, Israel had achieved victory over insurmountable odds and had tripled the area of land under Israeli control.
So all that against them, but incredibly, they went into I think it was the West Bank, and The people welcomed them because they thought they were the Iraqi soldiers. The Egyptian artillery, they just decided not to fire anymore. Crazy. And finally, unfortunately,
All we say to America is be true. I live in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country. Maybe I could have a certain basic freedom of speech. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest our rights. We aren't going to let it dogs or water hoses turn us around. We aren't going to let any injustice turn us around. It's ahead. Life longevity has its place. Not concerned about that now. Just want to do God's will.